All right, hello, everybody. I am Jamie Cheeseslice, the engineer and producer of Uncontrolled Opposition. This is Thursday, March 12th, and I hope everybody's out there having a great week and considering what's all going on in the world. We got a good show for you today. We're going to talk about Noam Chomsky and his legacy of how it's affected a lot of different things around the world and the conditions that people have had to deal with regards to regime change wars and American imperialism and all that. So we've got two really good guests today who are going to talk about that. Let's go ahead and bring on our host, Gloria and Jeremy. How are you guys doing?
Hey, Jamie.
Good to see you. And we'll go ahead and bring on our guests. And just for everybody at home, if this is the first time you have watched this show, we are a radio show first and foremost. We record the sessions for the radio, but we decided we're going to just do it live right here on YouTube so you can watch it completely uncut. Like last week, we had Scott Ritter on for 2 hours, but we had to cut that down to 50 minutes for the radio. So there's a lot more to watch here than there is to listen there. Anyway, with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Gloria, and you guys can just take it away.
Before I take it away, Jean, could you please center yourself in the screen on the side? So because we were also doing Twitter. Yeah, a little bit more.
Oh, yes.
You only have half a face there. A little bit.
You need to scoot the other direction.
Yeah, go the other. It's reversed. Okay, yeah, we got a little bit more.
Good.
Scoot a little bit more.
No, he's lost half a head.
Yeah, we can only see half your face on Twitter.
Yeah. Just move in the other direction than you think you were because it's backwards.
Okay. Almost. You're almost
okay,
there.
We're almost there. We're almost there. There you are. Okay. All right.
We can hand it over to Gloria. Have a good show.
Ready. Aim. Fire. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jamie Cheeseslice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today, we welcome back Jean Bricmont, Belgian theoretical physicist, philosopher of science, author, and professor, and Stephen Sefton, journalist, publisher, and activist living in Nicaragua, to discuss the recently exposed relationship between Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Epstein and its impact. News of Epstein and Chomsky's friendship and correspondence has sent shockwaves throughout what's considered the left in the United States and been the subject of many interviews and articles worldwide. Some of the anti-imperialist and truther left weren't surprised or dismayed, like Michael Parente, because despite Noam Chomsky's consistently condemning U.S.-backed coups and wars as violations of international law in Manufacturing Consent, 1988, Hegemony or Survival, 2003, and Failed States in 2006, he has dismissed investigations into the JFK assassination and 9/11, and he has ignored the U.S. military's role in manufacturing the COVID pandemic, and he has supported or ignored regime change efforts in Libya, Syria, and Nicaragua, just like the predator Epstein Class. Within this context, are our heroes and friends more dangerous to our peace movement than our enemies when they wrongly support erroneous State Department or CIA-driven narratives? Because we have learned to trust them. Should we ever surrender our own critical thinking skills to the opinions of others, even if they are celebrated experts? I was told in 2018 by a recently hired professor from my undergraduate alma mater, SUNY Westbury, at a class reunion that Nicaragua's regime should be changed because Noam Chomsky and Amy Goodman said so. Let that sink in. Even though I just returned from Nicaragua and was trying to explain the CIA's latest coup attempt, she wouldn't listen to a word I said. Also, I've seen leaders in our peace movement sidelined because of some questionable association, word, or deed. This turns peaceful protests and rallies into limited, member only events. Should participants in our peace movement be subjected to purity tests? Is then preventing nuclear war exactly the kind of existential threat that makes the enemy of my enemy my friend? Not just pragmatic, but a moral necessity? Thank you. Jeremy, please outline the key points raised in the article by Professor Chris Knight titled The Chomsky Epstein Puzzle that was published by Counterpunch on February 6th. And then we will have Jean and Stephen comment. Hopefully, we will have time to discuss the Epstein Class's war on Iran and humankind.
Okay, well, firstly, I should note that I met Chomsky several times, and he was a great mentor to me. And I mean, I didn't know him personally, but I have read many of his books and learned a great deal from him. And he also encouraged open debate. So, he said, I think the problem is some people developed a kind of cult of personality when he himself said not to take his own word, to do their own research and to think independently. And that's what a good professor does, encourage students to think independently, not to worship them. So we can debate his position on a certain point, but he encouraged himself independent inquiry. And I do think he may have misrepresented his position, especially on Libya. He opposed the war on Libya very forcefully. I believe he opposed U.S. intervention in Syria and Nicaragua as well. As an anarchist, though, he was prone to criticize governments like maybe he may have criticized the Nicaraguan government of Ortega for certain authoritarian features, or I know he did criticize the Assad government, but I don't think he necessarily, I don't see him ever having supported a regime change. He was very critical of U.S. imperialism and helped educate millions of people about U.S. imperialism. So I think he did a great public service. As far as the Knight article, I think Knight makes an argument that, is contested as to Chomsky's relationship with, because he worked for MIT for years as a faculty member. We know that's a heart of the so-called military-industrial complex. And I think Knight seems to suggest, and John Bricmont may know the book better than me, so I'm just kind of summarizing his argument that Chomsky may have been conflicted, that the military may have used. I don't think Chomsky himself had his own linguistic theories. I think Knight suggests the military may have thought some of his ideas could be useful for development of command and control systems. That doesn't mean Chomsky was developing the linguistic for that purpose. But that may have been, they had an interest in him and his work, and that may have been the reason they kept him at MIT, according to Knight, while he was involved in radical political activism and opposition to the Vietnam War. And that, I think, Knight suggests how he got connected with Epstein, and that the CIA and Deep State may have had interest in his linguistic research. And as far as the Epstein matter, personally, I don't think it should tarnish his reputation. I mean, I think obviously in hindsight he wouldn't have associated with Epstein. He shouldn't have. But I still regard him as a great thinker, even though some of his position I do agree with you. I don't agree with all his positions, but he did encourage independent thinking and debate on these issues. So.
Okay. Is that it for you, Jeremy? We'll turn it
Pretty
over.
much. I can maybe add more as the discussion unfolds.
Okay. Well, Jean, Noam Chomsky wrote a foreword to your 2006 book titled Humanitarian Imperialism, Using Human Rights to Sell War. And you have written a book titled Chomsky's Notebook, and both of you have quoted each other. How do you reconcile Chomsky's MIT Department of Defense work and friendship with Epstein with his brilliant and insightful writings?
Okay, thank you for having me. I will make a rather strong but nuanced defense of Chomsky, whom I admire very much his writings. On the MIT, by the way, has always replied that Marx used to work in the British Library, and the British Library was the summum of British imperialism, so he didn't think it matters very much that he worked at MIT. And I don't think he worked on military matters, even, the other writer didn't say that. I mean, in fact, artificial intelligence is really what the military used. And one of the latest theoretical article of Chomsky and others was a critique of artificial intelligence, saying it's not a model of the human brain. I mean, that's what he always says. So anyway, I'm not going to go into that because I don't have enough time. I want to start by making a general remark on text and the truth value of text. There are two extremes. One is religious text, whose truth value depends on the fact that the person who writes it or states it is, son of God or a messenger or a prophet or God himself or something like that. Then you can't discuss that. Okay, if you say that gays are going to burn in hell for eternity, that's true because it's said by some religious figure. If at the other extreme, you have scientific text. If you take Newton's equation or Einstein's equation or Darwin or whatever, well, you can say whatever you want about their moral qualities, which is a complicated matter, even for Einstein. But then, of course, the problem is that the equations are there and they're true or false, depending on whether they explain the world, whether they're empirically adequate, etc. I'm not going to go into a discussion about that. But it's nothing to do with the moral qualities of the person who writes them, because some other guy can write them. I've been teaching Newton's equation, and if Newton was a bad guy, then I'm not a bad guy, and the equations are true or false. So these are totally different relation to truth. On the other hand, and I would like to put thinkers, and in that I will put Marx, Chomsky, and so on, in the thinkers category, and I would like to put them, all of them, in the second category. One has to evaluate what they say on the basis of evidence, logic, etc., even though it can't be checked empirically the way natural sciences can be checked empirically. Okay. So that set the stage for what follows. But you see, when there was the hysteria, anti-communist hysteria in the 80s, the people discovered, I think it's true, but that Marx had a child with his maid, and then he had Engels recognize the child, and he was raised somewhere else. I mean, this episode, which I think is true, is not the most beautiful moral thing, but even when it happens and there was all this hysteria, and even Marxists were bothered by that. And my reaction was, okay, so is the labor theory value wrong? Is the surplus value theory wrong? Is what Marx wrote in the German ideology, the Communist Manifesto, and so on wrong? No, of course, it's nothing to do with it whatsoever. Nothing to do whatsoever. Of course, there is a cheap way, instead of studying Marx writing on economics and so on like that, then the cheap way is to use these arguments, say he's a bad guy, and therefore everything he says is wrong. But of course, if you apply it to scientific text, then you realize this nonsense. So you have to go through the hard work to actually read the text and evaluate their truth value. That's what people don't do. So when it comes to Chomsky, I will first go to criticism, which I've heard here, and which I think are not correct, are unfair, then go to his major contribution, and then end with my own criticism of Chomsky, which obviously I think are fair, but maybe you can agree or disagree. The unfair criticism starts with Epstein. For me, this is much ado about nothing. Many people have written about it, the problem with his children and his wife and so forth. I don't want to go into that, because even if to me, you see, it's my same reaction as with Marx. Even if everything, he was in compromise with all the crimes of Epstein, etc., does that prove that the Vietnam War was right? Does that prove that the media are trustworthy? Does that prove that the liberal intelligentsia is not confusing us all the time? No. So all the criticism that he has in his writing are true or false, irrespective of the Epstein business. Now, of course, and what I find irritating, people say, aha, now Epstein has shown that he has been controlled opposition all along. That's not true. It's simply not true. I mean, if you look at him in the 60s and the 70s and so on, he was certainly not controlled opposition, and he was extremely demonized. I mean, remember that one of the books he wrote with Roman, which was the first version of the political economy of human rights, was a book which was published, it was written, printed, etc. And the parent company of the company was publishing the book simply destroyed the company publishing the book, and they threw away all the books. And there's already advertisement, etc. So you can't say that he was the tool of the establishment at that time. And the New York Times certainly did not. I'll come back to what happened later, but at that time, certainly he was not a tool of the establishment. And when he was lecturing in universities, you had Jewish students coming with a booklet saying the lies of Noam Chomsky and so on, which I know, of course. Anyway, so I think one has to not to go backward and say, we see what he's been doing all along. Now, the three things that he's challenged for is the killing of JFK, 9/11, and COVID. These are three different issues. Now, I must say that both for JFK and 9/11, I don't believe the official story. But for JFK, and therefore I think everybody should be free to investigate it. And Chomsky is very dismissive. But Chomsky is dismissive all the time. He had a debate with Blankfort, whom I knew was a friend, and Blankfort was denouncing the role of the Israel lobbying in the US foreign policy long before Mearsheimer and Walt, and Chomsky was extremely dismissive. So that's his character. But on the other hand, you have to be dismissive if you want to put up all the pressure you have had all your life. Okay? I mean, during the Vietnam War, I mean, he was attacked all the time. So you have to have a very thick skin, which he had. And then, of course, the drawback of that, it was dismissive with everybody. So for JFK, I would say that, of course, I don't believe the official story, but I don't know what to believe. Is it the FBI? Is it the CIA because of Vietnam, because of Israel, because of Cuba, and so on? I don't know. And I've not spent time on that, but I don't see any definite proof of an alternative theory. Then my problem is indeed, and there I completely agree with Chomsky, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's a matter that we don't know. And there are so many crimes of US imperialism which are totally obvious. Okay, like they've attacked Iran. There's no justification whatsoever. Yet we, the left, cannot get across this message to the population that, you know, the current war on Iran, I mean, even the UN is condemning now Iran for his reaction to the, and you know, it's in France, I think the US is probably similar, but in France, even Chomsky say would expect better from France. I mean, France, just unbearable, the climate. Okay, it's all the fault of Iran. They're responsible for the war. They've done nothing. Okay, and this is obvious. And yet we can't get it across. So why spend time? It's your choice. You can spend time whatever you want. I spend time on quantum mechanics. That's not political, but we can, I don't spend time trying to figure out what happened in JFK because I think I never know for sure, and I'll never be able to convince people. So I put it aside, but people are free to do it. For 9/11, it's a bit different. There, I really think that the idea of it's all an inside job is very dubious for reasons I could explain. I don't think you could make the passenger of the plane that supposedly went into the Pentagon disappear like that. The Americans are willing to kill thousands of people abroad, but their own citizens, that's more unlikely. So anyway, so I don't want to go into that. And I don't believe the official story because, of course, the one thing which is not clear are the famous dancing Israelis. That, of course, is well established and, not explained by the official story. So probably the 9/11 people were real, but they were infiltrated, and the Israeli, as usual, did not tell everything they knew to their American friends or maybe to their American vassals. So, and then for COVID,
Also, the official report omitted Building 7. It didn't discuss the collapsing Building 7.
Okay, but
thanks.
Okay, let's put it aside because otherwise I will run over time. But I have an answer to that. I think it goes in the other direction. And for the COVID, I totally agree with the scientific view worldwide. Okay, I don't believe that all of American science is corrupted by big pharma, but certainly it's not true in France, where most research is public. It's not true in Russia and China and so on. Many countries, I mean, the US, especially the left, thinks that the US is like the world, but it's not the world. And there is research outside of the US, and which coincides with my view, which is that the virus was real and the vaccine was efficient in the main, and we had no alternative, and that's what the Chinese would say. Now, of course, the measures that were taken at that time, the confinement and so on, that can be discussed, but you could also understand that just a moment of panic. On the whole, the people who are anti-science had even worse ideas. So let me go to his contribution. First of all, I think even now, when I came to work in the US in 78, I never heard of him, by the way. It's not that well known in France. It's not well known in Belgium. It's not well known at all. I only read a text written by Marxists refuting his views on linguistic, but supposedly refuting. But I discovered this book in the public library, and then I really devoured them, for reasons of state, At War with Asia, American Power, The New Mandarins. All these were really fantastic books. And then later I came back to the US every year, and I used to say, I don't read the newspaper, wait until I come to the US and buy the next Chomsky book to know what's going on in the world. It was fantastic. And even about Israel, I'll come back to Israel. The Fateful Triangle is a book that has opened the eyes of many people. Even I think I've always been pro-Palestinian in some sense, because the cause, there is no argument, it's obvious. But nevertheless, the way he dismantled all the Hasbara, all the Israeli propaganda in the Fateful Triangle is really remarkable. The point is that he has an extraordinary, powerful intellect, and he can dismantle the argument of the propaganda. And that, of course, I think is remarkable. And of course, then there's manufacturing consent. When I read manufacturing consent, I was absolutely baffled, because even now I don't read newspapers, but at that time I was believing somewhat the newspapers or the TV news and so on. But I read that Parenti wrote a similar book and other people wrote similar books. That's true. But nevertheless, there is also necessary illusion, which assessor lectures he gave on the propaganda model. And of course, most of it is due to Herman, and I have infinite admiration for Ed Herman, who is different from Chomsky. But nevertheless, I admire a great deal that book, and it was very eye-opener for many people. Now, let me go to a more conceptual level. I would say that Chomsky, he thinks of himself as a child of the Enlightenment, which he is in some way, but I would say he's a Jewish, I'll come to the Jewish in a minute, a Jewish child of the Spanish Revolution. His first article was in 1939. He was 10-year-old and was at the fall of Barcelona to the Frankists. Now, of course, the Spanish Civil War, as you know, there was a bitter struggle between the anarchists and the Stalinists or the communists, which ended up in a disaster for both sides, which would be a lesson to all of us, but it's not, but anyway, I think he has been marked by that. This really was his, and then he was hanging around in these Jewish emigres in New York, who were radicals in many ways, vaguely anarchists, Trotskyists, etc. So he has been formed in his early years in a very, what he calls anti-Stalinist, I would call anti-communist mentality, certainly anti-Soviet Union. But on the other hand, and maybe he said bad things about Nicaragua later, but I translated into French. I've done a lot to promote him. French. I'm certainly the one who has done most to promote him, even though I think independently of him, as you will see in a minute, he gave the Managua lectures. Okay, those are really very good. And so he did that in Nicaragua, because Nicaragua wasn't communist, but it was, not exactly anarchist either. And about Cuba, he wrote a book with Vijay Prajad, and I remember seeing Vijay in Paris, and Vijay was saying, how can you write a book with an anarchist? But of course, you could say from Chomsky's point of view, how can you write a book with a Leninist? Because Vijay is explicitly Leninist. Nevertheless, he wrote a book with Vijay about Cuba, where he defends Cuba. So, his anti-communism is nuanced, but of course, he was very much anti-Soviet. On the other hand, I've been to the Soviet Union, I've been to the Eastern European state, and they all collapsed. And even Chomsky had defended them, they would have collapsed. And the point is that the atmosphere there was extremely repressive as far as free speech is concerned. You see, there was really propaganda, you could not deviate from the propaganda, etc. I totally understand the historical reasons for that, but I can also understand why people were, didn't like it. And Chomsky was certainly, Russell was like that too. But he wasn't anti-communist in the sense that, I think the atmosphere in Cuba, in Nicaragua, certainly in China now, or in Vietnam, is very different. There is much more opening or possibility of discussion than there was in the Soviet Union or in the satellite states. And so that's how I understand this his attitude that I don't share. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he says the victory for socialism. That was a big mistake because, of course, we saw what happened afterwards wasn't exactly that. I mean, so he can say absolutely terrible things, but nevertheless, he had some very positive views on imperialism and so on. Then the other thing, which I think will remain from Chomsky, is that he initiated a revolution in social sciences or the human sciences. Because in the 50s, on the East, you had Marxism, and on the West, you had behaviorism. And both attitudes were totally ignorant of the notion of human nature, of a biologically determined human nature. And that Chomsky brought back that. He said, well, if you learn things, you see, for example, go to China, stay there for 3 years, don't make any effort to learn the language, you won't know the language. But you're a baby, you hear all this noise because Chinese is just noise for us, but the baby too, and the baby speaks Chinese. So how does he do it? You see, he explained that there must be an innate, it's not just a learning mechanism in a la Piaget and so on. There must be a very structured innate basis that allows you to learn that. And it's also true then for moral rules, for aesthetic rules, for all kinds of things. And then he made a real, I don't like Kuhn, but he made a paradigm change in the social sciences when he started in 1950s with his critique of Skinner, of behaviorism. Of course, he was also a critique of Marxism, but of historical materialism, but that's put it on the side. So I myself had never thought of that. So even though I read a lot of so-called philosophy, social sciences before going to the States, and that was a revelation for me. And I think whatever happened to his linguistic, his precise idea on linguistic, that's another question. But now, you have cognitive science, you have evolutionary psychology, except maybe in France, but even there it's changing. That's dominated the social sciences, and it really started in the 50s with Chomsky. Not only him, but I won't go into the whole history, but in particular with him. Then, of course, that's related to that, of course, is his critique of postmodernism back in 1992, before all the right-wing critique of postmodernism, or even the one that I did with Sokal and me. I mean, he started it, and we were inspired by him. And it was absolutely beautiful, his defense of science. And his attack on postmodernism was hilarious. Then you have also to see that he has been debating with Foucault, with William Buckley. I remember the debate with Buckley, and I remember when I was in the States, I was watching Firing Line of Buckley with fascination, because I came from at that time Europe was very social democratic and pacifist, etc. And so when you see this unbelievable reactionary, I couldn't believe it. Of course, now Europe is like that. Unfortunately, we change a lot. But at that time, it was unbelievable. And Chomsky debated him. He debated Piaget, as I just said, which is in Cerisy in France. It's a very interesting debate where you have biologists and disciples of Piaget and so on, and Fodor and so on, they're all debating innateness and so on. And then with Foucault is a total moral relativist. In Chomsky says in Foucault, you have no argument that you shouldn't put gay people in the gas chambers, because there is no moral, there is no argument. Okay, there is no argument against the policy of the United States. I mean, his moral relativism is totally destructive. And the debate wasn't starting early enough, but at least Chomsky gave some argument about that. He also did that in a debate in Brussels, which I argued with him. I played devil's advocate defending Foucault, and that took place then there are two other points, which is the ones which is most hated in France, is the issue of the little matter of free speech, as Herman calls it. There was a hysteria in France with Faurisson. When Faurisson, as far as I'm concerned, did nothing. He wrote a letter to Le Monde, and Le Monde published it. He was challenging the history of the gas chamber, but he didn't force anybody, he didn't kill anybody, he didn't argue to kill anybody. Okay, and there was a huge hysteria, like the Republic is in danger, etc. And then, of course, they attacked him physically several times, they banned him from teaching, etc. And then Chomsky signed a petition signed by other people, but including him, saying that his civil rights should be protected. And then there's a huge campaign against him from all the people. It was the late 70s, and people had been because of the Khmer Rouge, to which I come in a minute, they had been revising their views. They had been totally abandoning anti-imperialism. There was a section of the left which was anti-imperialist, and then they say, oh, we made a terrible mistake. Look at the boat people, Sartre, and so on. They were, and look at the Khmer Rouge. It was awful, etc. And then also they took the opportunity to attack anti-Semitism. There was no anti-Semitism. There was no far right, nothing. They created it, but it didn't exist. And so Chomsky was extremely principled there, and he was extremely attacked. And then he wrote a preface. He didn't mean it to make a preface to a book of Foyson, which was just a memoir that he gave in defense in a court case where he was sued. I mean, he should be allowed to defend himself. And Chomsky wrote a preface entirely on free speech, which is beautiful, which is excellent, and which he republished in the book that you mentioned, the French version of the book that you mentioned, the Notebook. So, I mean, it's an excellent text. And then, of course, then the whole hell broke loose. I mean, you have no idea. Even to this day, you see, I've been banned from speaking about physics, not because of my views on physics, but because of my view on free speech, not on my view on Palestine. Well, they're not popular. They're not. Just free speech, okay? This is the most taboo thing in France that you can imagine. You have no idea. And so there I thought he was very good. And then there's Cambodia. What happened there when the Khmer Rouge took power, when the whole American Indochina collapsed in 1975, immediately when the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh, they said, well, it's going to be a genocide and so on and so forth. And then Chomsky and Herman wrote an article where they reviewed the evidence that was available at that time. And they said there is no evidence of a genocide happening now. But apparently, I think 76, 77, the Khmer Rouge committed vast atrocities. And that put Chomsky in an awkward position because you could say, aha, we told you so. You see, he said several times, not because it turned out to be correct later, and even said with Herman, maybe the worst will come out. But then he was really, I think that changed his attitude. He felt very uneasy about defending the bad guys. So to get rid of those problems, he said, well, Milosevic is a thug. Of course, he was critical of Gaddafi and so on, in ways which I think are totally unfair, but can be explained maybe because he was burned by the Cambodian affair, where I think he was completely right. But then, of course, in order to protect himself, he compared constantly Cambodia with East Timor, which I think are very different situations. The real argument with Cambodia is that it's the Americans who brought the Khmer Rouge into power by their bombing. If they hadn't overthrown Sihanouk and put Lon Nol and all the bombings, the Khmer Rouge would not have come to power in the first place. And they were overthrown in 1979 by the Vietnamese. And then what did the Americans do? Support the Khmer Rouge at the Cambodian-Thai border. I mean, there is nothing remotely conceivable as an argument, but that is the beginning of the human rights industry, which I criticize in my book on humanitarian imperialism, because that's how it started. And all my life I thought, yeah, but the Khmer Rouge, we shouldn't intervene. No, it's not true. You did intervene. And that's because you intervened that the Khmer Rouge came to power, and the whole tragedy goes back to that. I think that would have been a better argument, but Chomsky didn't use that argument. But nevertheless, of all the intellectuals I know, especially in France, he's the only one who did not turn his coat. Because everybody else said, oh, we supported this monster and so on. He did not support that monster. I mean, Chomsky said, the Indochina war, the only result will be Indochina dominated by North Vietnam, because that will be the only way to have a livable society. But of course, those human rights people don't care whether the society is livable or not. All they want is to look holy. So I will finish by the fact that the issue of being Jewish. Well, he grew up in a very Jewish and very Zionist family, and he's pretty critical. You see, for example, he was making fun of his aunt, who was living in Philadelphia, I think, and was calling stores, department stores downtown, speaking Yiddish to them in order to force them to hire a Jew, which I thought was rather funny. And more deeply, he was remarking to me that his grandfather, who came from Ukraine, was very religious. He was working, he was checking whether food was kosher, etc. He came and that's a very deep point. He said he transferred from his view of the Ukrainian peasant to American blacks. And what was that view? A mixture of contempt and fear. And that, I think, goes a long way to explain anti-Semitism, by the way. because of course the contempt is there. You can't deny it because Jews are viewed as a chosen people. He was religious, so it's not even debatable as chosen people. And of course, he despises the other guys. Then when the other guys hear them, they're not happy about it, and they are more numerous. There goes a pogrom, and of course there is a contempt and fear, and there is this dual attitude. But Chomsky was totally lucid about that. Okay. On the other hand, when he was young, he couldn't go in front of a school, a Jesuit school, one of school that I went to, but in another time and place, because the children there would beat up young Jewish children. In 1940, when Paris fell, there were beer parties near his house among Germans and, of course, Irish who were celebrating the fall of Paris. As a Jewish kid, he may not have been very happy. So he's defended the free speech, for example. He's been very far in defending free speech. He has never really used the weapon of anti-Semitism, but he's been concerned. For example, when he was in Paris in 2010, I think there was a US general, I forget which one, who had been touring the Near East, and came back and said, our support for Israel is putting in danger the US troops. Of course, it was true, but he was uncomfortable with that because he said, well, but anti-Semitism in the US is just under the surface and so on. It may, and so he was worried about that. It's normal. Okay? I mean, I'm not Catholic, but the Catholic education certainly influences me. And so he's influenced by his Jewish background. But I think also that his attitude with respect to Israel is to be very critical in order to tell Israel not to do the follies that they do in order to save Israel from its own follies. And he viewed himself, he said it, as a prophet, as a Jewish prophet telling the Jews, to repent their ways. So that's his view. It's not my view, of course, but I'm just trying to explain. But then, of course, the problem also after 9/11, he became more mainstream in a sense, and he was not at all before that, I can assure you. But after 9/11, you see, part of the ruling class realized that the situation is really serious, and there was an opening up of critical voices, just as there was at the end of the Vietnam War. Of course, it was quickly closed, but that's why maybe people have this impression that Chomsky is more respected or more mainstream than he really was before that. And I think that's entirely due to the shock of 9/11. But the drawback is that then his prophet attitude led him to judge other government, which I think one shouldn't do. One should never criticize. I would never criticize a government targeted by the United States. But then he started to criticize Nicaragua and Libya and so on. On the Libyan war, I can tell you something which I saw, which is really horrible. I was with Diana Johnstone in Brussels when when the Libyan war started. And we were in a cafe, and there were Libyan immigrants who came over for the war, of course, and they came to congratulate him. And he was embarrassed, and he didn't explain why. But the reason, of course, is that because he was approving the UN resolution leading to this no-fly zone that was then abused by the others, etc. Obviously, he was not that much against the war, and he's been wishy-washy about these things. And as I said, the main problem for me is the total denial of the role of the lobby. For me, the war with Iran, the war with Pakistan, everything is due to the lobby, and there's no US interest in that whatsoever. And that has been in total denial, which is again related to his Jewish. I mean, he's afraid of anti-Semitism. I don't think it should lead to anti-Semitism, but it does lead. I mean, if you go to the social network in the US, it's full of violent anti-Semitic rant because people are upset with the idea that the US is actually led by the pro-Israel lobby, which is true. That's unavoidable, but the last remark is that when he was in 2011, he was in Paris and he was discussing with people from unions, and he was defending really unlimited immigration from West Africa. And that I thought was really crazy. His argument was that West Africa had been colonized by France, and that's why they wanted to come to France, which is totally false because those guys would go to Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Belgium, anywhere they could go out of Africa. And so there was a very bad argument. But the worst thing is that in taxi going back to his hotel, I accompanied him in taxi. Then he explained to me that the people who spoke about the right of return of Palestinians were only fostering the far right in Israel. But what he had done in France was just fostering the far right with much worse argument, because at least the Palestinians are either expelled or descendants of people who are expelled from Palestine, which is not the case of Africans coming to France. So you see, my conclusion is that Chomsky is a towering figure in thinking, okay? And you have to take him for that. Now, of course, he has defects. Marx has defects. As a joke, when I was criticizing Chomsky, I said even Stalin, Stalin, he recognized Israel. So, I mean, you just a thinker, but you are free to think about him whatever you want. I just don't think dismissing him as uncontrolled opposition because of Epstein, that I think is completely wrong.
Well, thank you, Jean. We're gonna switch to Stephen Sefton.
I'm sorry.
No, it's perfect. It was, very excellent. Stephen, you were on the front lines in Nicaragua in 2018 when Noam Chomsky repeated the U.S. State Department's regime change lies that wrongly influenced the left, and you experienced firsthand the effects of the violence it unleashed on the people of Nicaragua and the destruction it did to its economy. In essence, words have effect. Thank you, Steve.
No, and thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion, and thank you, Jean, for your very informative remarks. I learned a lot from what you said. Perhaps I should explain that I'm not a good person to talk about Chomsky because he's not been an important influence in my life. I did read Chomsky when I was very young. I read his book, Reflections on, I think it was Reflections on Language, which was basically a polemic against B.F. Skinner and the empiricism of B.F. Skinner. And I found that very convincing. Subsequently, through the 80s, I was practically unaware of Chomsky, I'm afraid. And I think one of the things, and through the 90s as well, which I was aware of him as a very important influence, but he was not somebody who was particularly interesting to me. I think I read his book, Turning the Tide, about US aggression in Central America, and that was fine. I thought that was fine as far as it went, a very useful book for people who knew nothing about Central America. And I think I may have read another of his books in the 90s, but I forget. And I think one of the things that Jean's remarks did remind us of, is the fact that times change, people change. And so what Noam Chomsky may have represented through the 80s will not have been exactly the same as what he represented and what he thought during the 90s. And as Jean said, after 2011, which is when I became aware of him really, he again perhaps may have changed to a less radical position, a more conventional position. And I felt that was strongly borne out by what Chomsky's position on the Resolution 1973 in 2011, which I thought was absolutely disgraceful on his part. But even before then, because I'm in Nicaragua, I was aware of his influence about people, the opinion of people in the United States and Western Europe about the FSLN, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional here in Nicaragua. And I must say that I feel complete contempt for his influence on opinion about Nicaragua at that time, because it seems to me absolutely clear that he betrayed his own principles of looking at facts and relied on what his friends from Nicaragua told him, who were all virulently anti-Sandinista. I may be wrong about that, but that's certainly the impression that I had at that time. And I wrote against Chomsky at that time because of that. The Social Democrat anti-Sandinistas, the ex-Sandinistas, people like Sergio Ramirez, very eminent people, but absolutely contemptible in their anti-democratic approach to dealing with their own country, Nicaragua. Dora Maria Tellez, for example, another one. There are many examples. And I think that one of the things that I feel strongly, not just about Chomsky, but about what I call the neo-colonial left in North America, in Western Europe, is that they are deeply anti-democratic. Who is Noam Chomsky or any of the people that criticize the events in Nicaragua to say that the Nicaraguan people got it wrong and they shouldn't have voted for Daniel Ortega? He didn't say that, but that's obviously what he's implying. How dare they assume that they know better than the people of Nicaragua? How dare they? And so I think this has to do with class. And I didn't finish high school. I have a different point of view from academics like, say, Jean Bricmont or other academics, very distinguished people. And I admire them for their achievements. But I look at this from a class point of view, and I think Noam Chomsky and others represent a class that is essentially a neo-colonial class in the way that they are able to manage opinion. Now, Jeremy has said, and Jean has said, that Noam Chomsky encouraged debate, and they encourage people to think for themselves. And that's fine as so far as it goes. But the concrete fact is that as individuals, they have tremendous influence. For example, through outlets like Zenit, or through a progressive outlet in the UK called Media Lens. They have great influence, and so that I'm not saying that they themselves do this consciously and that they're bad people. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have to recognize that there is this class effect. And from the point of view of people like myself here in Nicaragua, I'm a Nicaraguan citizen now. I've lived here for almost 35 years, devoting my life to community education and preventive healthcare and other activities. And from my point of view, it's deeply neo-colonial. And so, I admire Chomsky's output, and I'm perfectly happy to accept that he's an outstanding intellectual figure. But over the last 10, 15, 20 years, his views on Nicaragua have been very unhelpful, to put it mildly, to people here in Nicaragua. And so going back to 2008, and here's something, when I say that Chomsky's remarks, especially around, for example, the events here in 2018, are in a sense a betrayal of his own commitment to good research, to good investigation, to honest investigation. And just a simple example here from 2018. At the start of the events in April 2018, one of the main things that people were saying was that the government's social security reforms were an attack on workers and pensioners. That was a very important element of the psychological warfare campaign against us here in Nicaragua, against our government. But if you look at, I've been through all the literature. I've looked at what academics wrote. I've looked at what mainstream and alternative press wrote about the events in 2018. Not one of them read the reform. There's nothing about what the reform actually said. And it got to the point, the absurd point, where supposedly progressive left-wing outlets, and perhaps we can discuss later on whether any kind of left exists at all anymore. All these outlets were putting out the absurd suggestion that the reason the big business organization here in Nicaragua withdrew from the talks about the Social Security reform was because they were concerned about its effect on pensioners and workers. Have you ever heard anything so absurd? But that was what a lot of people on the so-called left were suggesting. And that this was the explanation for the sudden outburst of protest against the government. When it was very, very obviously something that had been manufactured and worked on by the US Embassy, through its proxies, through the NGOs, through their human rights NGOs that had put out lie after lie over the previous 20 years about what was happening in Nicaragua, about the FSLN. It was absolutely clear that this was an attempt at regime change, one of the so-called color revolutions, one of the soft coups that the United States has been notorious for ever since. When
was
the first one that we could think of? Maybe Serbia, perhaps. But anyway.
Stephen, could you just say some of the things that were going on that were violent? Because, this is very theoretical, but things were happening that, people were dying. Institutional facilities were being bombed, like the radio station, Radio Ya.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria. And I tend to, I go off on tangents. I'm sorry. So, one of the key elements of the attack in 2018 was to impose terror. So what people did was, what the golpistas, the coup-mongering, the coup promoters and their gangs did, was they target Sandinistas. So they set up these roadblocks in both urban areas and rural areas. And if anybody going through those roadblocks that was identified as a Sandinista, especially a police officer, was liable to be detained, tortured, beaten up, and in some cases murdered. And there's a notorious case of a police officer who is detained in Messiah, tortured for 3 days, shot in the legs. Then they set fire to him and bombarded him with very heavy paving stones. And that was just one. There's so many cases. 400 police officers suffered gunshot wounds from the peaceful protesters. Okay, and that's this is an established fact that the government has tried to put to the international human rights organizations, but they never even mentioned that. They never mentioned that 400 police officers suffered gunshot wounds. A friend of ours who was in an ambush on Mother's Day in 2018, May 30th, 2018, he was shot in the leg by peaceful protesters at a roadblock in La Trinidad. And there are so many cases. There are arguments about how many people were killed in Nicaragua, and this is a feature of all these regime change attempts. For example, in January, January this year, the Western media were alleging that the Iranian security forces had murdered 30,000 people. Absolutely ridiculous. And the same thing happened here in Nicaragua. They were claiming that up to 1,000 people had been killed by the evil Nicaraguan police. In fact, the actual figures are, I think, just under 200. And of those, a third are definitely Sandinista supporters and Sandinista militants and police officers. 22 police officers were shot dead. 22. Imagine if that had happened in New York. Nicaragua has a population of 7 million at the moment. What's the population of New York? Imagine what would happen if even half a dozen police officers were shot dead in New York by protesters. But what was the response of the government through all that time? The response of the government through all that time was to try and engage in dialogue. They even accepted the right-wing Catholic Church hierarchy as mediators in the dialogue, even though the right-wing church hierarchy were part of the golpistas. And
there were videos showing Catholic priests involved in the torture of Sandinistas. And in addition,
and none of that was reported. I think one of the problem may be that Chomsky is reading the same, like in the Vietnam era, There was, peace groups, missionary groups. There was alternative media that were reporting on things that he could draw on, because he's not connected very much to Nicaragua. I mean, I'm not defending. I agree with your points, Stephen, that he got this wrong. But maybe he was lazy, or also there's no reporting at all, like in the Vietnam. Because if you read his books, like on Vietnam, he's drawing on alternative sources. There's journalists.
Jeremy, that's not exactly true. I was writing a lot in 2018 in defense of the Sandinistas. And I was exposing the lies. I was writing about the lies that our media was representing.
What websites are you writing on?
But that's I think the big point that Stephen is making is that
these
are like gatekeepers. And
well, I don't think Chomsky necessarily the gatekeeper. I think what I'm trying to say here, maybe what happened, because I agree with Stephen's points. What may have happened is that he doesn't have that information that Stephen is describing. He's getting certain things about Nicaragua, maybe from some old friends of his, as you say, who are Sandinistas. And there's nothing, and that's the fault of the entire media and alternative media in the U.S. The supposed alternative media is not drawing on these reports of what's really going on in Nicaragua. And then you have Chomsky, he's a busy guy and he's focused on all world issues, and he's not devoting, he may just read one or two things on Nicaragua, and he's not getting to Gloria's piece, because your piece is on a website that's unfortunately it may be a website that's kind of blacklisted, or nobody reads it. So,
basically that's what happens. But unfortunately,
Jean wants to say something.
Because I've learned a lot from both of you. So
we're at the end. We're at the end of the time for the show. Yeah, I know. It's just we're just getting warmed up. We have some more time on video afterwards, but this is the end of our radio show. So I just have to say I'd like to give Jean and Stephen a chance to tell our audience how they can follow your respective work, because especially Jean is really I've been reading his stuff on X, and he's really focused on these same lies that we're told about Nicaragua, that we're told about Syria, that we're told about Libya, are the same lies being told about Iran, and Jean's posting a lot of stuff on that right now. So let me. And also, the United States, using its handmaiden, the United Nations, is doing all kinds of ridiculous reports that are complete and utter lies on Nicaragua right now. And I just want to say Nicaragua is, and Cuba are like as Venezuela are in the crosshairs, and Latin America is something that us on the left, or the so-called left, better step up for and start defending, because it's out of control. So anyway, Jean and Stephen.
Just quickly, mine's very simple. It would be more complicated for John. My website is tortillaconsal.com, and you can read all my stuff and other stuff about Nicaragua in English and Spanish on that site. So thank you very much, Gloria.
And Jean, please.
Well, about Nicaragua, I can tell an anecdote. Years ago, I was.
Well, no, we don't have time for an anecdote. We only have time for you to quickly tell us where we could find your work.
Oh, I don't have much work. I have a Substack now, which I may put things on, and otherwise I put things on Facebook and Twitter for the moment. I did several videos recently, but they are in French, so I don't have. It was very, since October 7th, I was so flabbergasted by the propaganda that I was very discouraged, as I told you already. I may come pick up a little bit more, but I try mostly to do it in French. Of course, I know English, but I think in France, there is so little dissident voice that I try to do it there.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks to our guests for joining us, and hopefully we'll have them back again. This is multiple times now that we've had these guests, because we love them. So The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week. Okay, we're still recording, so you can finish your thoughts, gentlemen.
Yeah, Jean, what were you going to say?
Well, I saw the Fête de l'Humanité. Some years ago, I saw the ambassador of Nicaragua to France, and she was talking to her daughter back in Nicaragua, and the daughter was saying, "Mom, how come we're in power and I can't go out in the street because of the opposition?" You see, there were such thugs, real thugs, and even the so-called dictatorship couldn't go out in the street, which tell you something about the situation. But at that time, the communists were allowing, I mean, I'm not going to do it now, but because they become so mainstream, but they were allowing such views. But I completely agree with Nicaragua. I think what happened with Chomsky is this, you see, he has always been about human rights. I think human rights should be viewed in context, you know. I don't think you have to defend human rights in every revolutionary situation and so on. I don't believe in that. But he does tend to that. I mean, it's linked with anarchism and it's anti-state. You see, it's always, as I say, it's a child of the Spanish Civil War. And so there is this bias against the state. And then, of course, because he became more prominent, he gets all the people in exile, and especially the turncoat from the people from the Nicaragua, Venezuela. And they're always, every revolution has Trotskyists, okay? They're turncoat or something, and then they go to Chomsky and they say, "Oh, you know, there are atrocious human rights violations, etc." And there was that. I mean, Glenn Greenwald had a very good article saying that there were people like that during the Vietnam War, but you know, emigres that were promoting the war. But Chomsky and the others didn't listen to them back to those people that back then. But then, of course, now things have changed, and I think he's more susceptible. And exactly what I described at the beginning of the Syrian war, there were these Syrian emigres who were congratulating him, and probably those who came to talk to him were emigres, and he didn't have really time or to check the facts, and he was probably listening to them much too much. And his anti-state bias and his pro-human rights bias, you know, fit into this sort of thing. People didn't say, "Oh, these people are awful communists, they want to nationalize everything." No, they didn't say that. They say, you know, those people are violating human rights, they're not allowing opposition, and so on and so forth. And that, I think, is a weak spot in Chomsky. It's a very weak spot, and I'm really sorry. On the other hand, you know, as I said about the Spanish Revolution and the conflict between communists and anarchists, we are so weak that we should not divide ourselves too much and try to find a weak spot in Chomsky or somebody else or me. I mean, there is so much opposition on the other, so much awful people on the other side that. But I completely agree with Stephen's remark about Chomsky. I didn't know about my knowledge of Chomsky in Nicaragua, the Managua lectures, which I think were quite high. You see, he wasn't criticized for Sandinistas back then.
Can I just make a quick remark before we hear from Jeremy and Gloria? One of the things that I found very striking during my experience in 2018 was I'm very fortunate to have a good relationship, a good friendship with Brian Wilson, the very well-known peace activist, who now lives in Nicaragua. And Brian, back in, I think it was 2008, he co-signed a letter with Chomsky criticizing the Nicaraguan government or criticizing the FSLN, which was in government at that time, Daniel Ortega, for not allowing Dora Maria Tellez, the social democrat ex-Sandinista, to not allowing that party to stand in municipal elections in Managua in 2008. Now, there's a long backstory to that. I won't go into it, but basically that was a lie. They were writing on the basis of a lie. It was the right-wing party of Arnaldo Alemán that instigated the process in the Electoral Council to prevent Dora Maria Tea's party from participating in the elections. But that was completely misrepresented as the FSLN government taking that step, which is false. So Brian was on the same page as Noam Chomsky at that time. Go forward 10 years, 2018. Brian's living in Grenada. He witnessed what happened. And I remember doing a video with him. If I can find the link, I'll send it to you later on, in which he starts out saying in that video, one of the things that I found absolutely incomprehensible is how it was possible for media in the United States and media outside Nicaragua to present what was happening here as the complete opposite of what I, Brian Wilson, was experiencing. That's almost textually what he said. And so what does that mean? That means that for very different being in a country, obviously, to and experiencing that reality and just commenting on that reality without really getting to familiar with what was really happening. And you know, and there's a rule of thumb. I don't know if you agree with this, but
wait, before you go there, I just want to say to our audience who Brian Wilson is. He was a Vietnam, I believe. Well, no, actually, it was for sending the weapons to Nicaragua. He laid down in. Please tell the story, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, Brian Wilson was a Vietnam vet who served in Vietnam, and he became very anti-war. And through the 80s, he was campaigning against the United States support for the military dictatorships in Central America that were killing their own people. And he was campaigning on behalf of the Nicaraguan revolution, the Sandinista revolution here. And as part of his protest, he participated with some other Vietnam vets in an activity outside an arms factory. I've forgotten in which town it was, somewhere in the United States.
I think it was California.
Right.
I think.
And what they did was they laid down on the railway tracks in the hope that they'd be able to symbolically stop a locomotive carrying dozens of wagons of ammunition destined for the wars in Central America in support of the United States allies there. And in the past, their experience had been that, you know, that they'd either get removed but this time, nobody removed them, and the train kept on coming. And Brian was, while his comrades were able to get off the rails in time, Brian couldn't. The train ran over him. He suffered damage to his brain, and his legs were amputated around the knee. Somehow he survived. I have no idea. And if miracles happen, that was a miracle, how he survived that. And ever since then, he's been a passionate supporter of the Sandinista revolution. And so although he had that kind of lapse, I'd call it a lapse, in 2008, signing that petition, that incorrect, falsely based petition in 2008. In 2018, he was here and he was able to testify to what really happened.
Well, the CIA's dirty tricks, as Jeremy and I speak about very often, these are their techniques that they go in and they increase the amount of information that is incorrect or that's complete fiction. And then they suppress any information that actually is true because they want to drive a particular narrative. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure Noam Chomsky and, you know, other people get swept up into that, you know, that those lies. And, you know, it's really important for our audience to always, you know, question things. And, you know, I was in Nicaragua in 2018, and all of a sudden, all of this information from every source was saying the same exact thing. And it reminds me of what's going on now with Iran. It's like every channel you turn on, the United States is winning. This is happening. That's happening. How great it is. This is the most fantastic thing. And then if you go off that network and you start digging, you're finding out, oh my God, all these things are going wrong. And Iran has bombed, in to defend themselves, 16 bases and installations. And it's only today. Now, we've known about these successful bombing operations for, I don't know, 2 weeks, but it's just today that the New York Times has finally admitted this. So, there is an information war. And, it's only through, really using your intuition, using your investigative skills and your judgment that you can kind of see through this. And, as I was saying, in Nicaragua, you would have believed that this was happening if you didn't know otherwise. And because I've been a student of this from, my whole upbringing, I was like, oh, this is the CIA color revolution redo. This is the 70s. This is the 70s all over again. So what can I say? In the 80s all over again.
And that was the point I was trying to make.
Go ahead.
Excuse me?
Gloria, what did the New York Times accept?
It finally said that 16 military bases and installations were hit with Iranian fire. Up until that point, only the United States was successful.
But my point was, if you read Chomsky's earlier books, he was able to draw on I think there was a little more media opening, like as the Vietnam War progressed, there, the media, so many people were negative, and there was some space for more independent reporting, like Seymour Hersh, and there were reports on a lot of the atrocities, and there were also, because I've read those books and I've assigned them to students. I think he was at the forefront in seeing how this human rights industry, spun things to support U.S. empire. But he was drawing on like missionaries sometimes, stuff, or alternative media. But then I think reports to contradict the mainstream narrative. But then that got co-opted. Like our show has shown how alternative media has become just as corrupt and co-opted, and that these maybe it's the same bias Chomsky had for the anti-state, that the government is always bad, so the Gaddafi, the Assad, or the Ortega are presented as kind of monstrous in the alternative media as much as the mainstream media, and you don't have these real reporting from on the ground. That's been totally censored, and on the internet you can only find some websites that don't get a lot of traffic, and that Chomsky may not have been reading. He would, like The Nation magazine or the one we can't mention, they're not reporting the real story. It's only a website that, unfortunately,
we can mention the bad guys here. We just can't mention them on
Democracy
WBAI.
Now,
Democracy Now.
And Chomsky was close to Amy Goodman, and their reporting was awful on Syria and Nicaragua, and they they're gatekeeper defining the left. So I think he was probably, got some of his information there. He didn't have but he was also not writing books by this time. This is, as you say, the Chomsky in his prime was writing these great books, debunking the official narrative about Vietnam, and even his stuff on Cambodia. I think because his book, The Political Economy of Human Rights, the second volume dealt with Cambodia and Laos, and it's a very good book. He shows how the media left out the terrible U.S. bombing of Cambodia in the 70s, the coup, and how that totally destabilized the country and fueled the orgy of violence. And he referred to this decade of genocide, how the media framed it that the genocide started with the Khmer Rouge, and he quoted a report, decade of genocide. It started really with the U.S. invasion, and the media left out that side of the story. So he was really on his mark there, but I think, my opinion. But yeah, he wasn't writing books like that. I didn't know what you said about Libya. I thought he opposed it, but maybe he did. As you pointed out, he seemed to have supported it. But he wasn't writing books at that point. He was an older guy. He wasn't doing the same research. So yeah, I don't think it was the same Chomsky the last 10 years. When he was in his prime, he was more, but I think he had better sources to draw on to counteract the main narrative than today.
Well, my dad's I guess was a little older than Chomsky, and my father was an avid reader his whole life. But then when he hit his mid-90s, he couldn't read. He really had a lot of trouble reading, and he started watching television. And I think that happens to a lot of people when you get up there in those 90s. That it's hard to read. It's a lot easier to have the television on. The television is basically the corporate news, and it's very convincing because it's repetitive. It does these mind techniques of just repeating the same message over and over and over and over again on any channel. And after a while, and then the newspapers also have the same exact stuff, and you begin to believe that. And as I was saying, I almost believe that if I didn't know better with Nicaragua, because it was in every source. It was Facebook, Twitter, the New York Times, the radio, the television, the left, luminaries. Everyone was on that same page. And what I want to say is when you get this targeted media, it is a brainwashing technique, this repetition.
Yeah, even seasoned anti-war activists are affected.
Can I just say that I think that it's very important to understand, and this your program is a very important resource against this. We're subject to psychological warfare all the time, and it's absolutely relentless. And so sometimes the focus will shift in terms of foreign affairs coverage. It'll shift, but the messages are basically always the same, aren't they? I mean, you get the same messaging about Iran that you were getting about Iraq, for example. Same messaging about Nicaragua that you're getting about Cuba and Venezuela, and I think one of the important things that intellectuals like Chomsky and academics, and they have most people don't have the chance to do any research, but academics and writers and journalists, I hate that term actually, but that's another discussion, that's their job. Their job is to focus on rooting out the truth and looking at what are the real outcomes. What has been the outcome of, what is it now? It's almost 20 years. It's almost 20 years of government here in Nicaragua under the Sandinista and Daniel Ortega. And we have something like 80 hospitals in the public health system, which is something like 4 or 5 times the number of public hospitals in neighboring countries. It's just ridiculous. We have the best highways. We have the best animal and crop sanitary system, recognized across Latin America and in the world, so that our agricultural and livestock exports can go anywhere because they're certified as being of the highest quality. No, and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. It's so difficult. Nicaragua's education system is regarded. The UNICEF had actually said that Nicaragua's health, but this was back in 2023, I think. Nicaragua's health system is a model that other countries come to look at. And so but none of that, of course, none of that gets reported. Of course it doesn't. None of it. And so that goes back to what you were saying, Gloria, about the psychological warfare. Sorry, I just wanted to get that in.
Go ahead, Joe.
I just wanted to, I think you have to look at foreign sources. There is no good source, even the alternative media, maybe you, but very few alternative media, even ZNet and so on, or Democracy Now! Should be called Democracy Cloud. I mean, it's not, I listen to Russian sources or people I listen to Marandi, which is Iranian. I always listen to foreign sources. I don't know Spanish, but I listen sometimes to Telesur. I mean, it's only that way because in the US, indeed, even the alternative sources like supposedly Democracy Now, or they are too much mainstream. I think as Chomsky got old, but since Stephen was making a remark about intellectuals, I can assure you that Chomsky certainly had an influence on me in making me extremely suspicious of intellectuals back in the old days. Maybe you should be suspicious of him, but certainly, and I'm certainly not accepted by other intellectuals. I told you, even if I speak about physics, I can be banned from speaking. So in France, at least, so it's not at all, and I don't take pride in being an intellectual. I just happen to be, but I don't think I'm perfectly agreeing with Bakunin's remark on intellectuals, which Chomsky has been amplifying, and I think in his younger days he was quite right about the critique of intellectuals as being a servant of the system in general.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to reveal a detail here, a personal detail. When I was in Nicaragua, I was, seeing these headlines saying that these were peaceful protesters, and then, I was seeing them with mortars and guns, and then there'd be a headline underneath somebody, with a mortar and a gun who had these giant muscles, and they were saying that these were peaceful student protesters, and they look like guerrillas. They had trained mercenaries. They didn't look like, skinny Nicaraguan students, which is what most students look like in Nicaragua, especially, young boys and girls. And, so I was so upset that I started looking for some place where I could actually get this. And I found Tortilla Consal, and I found Stephen, and Stephen kind of took me under his wing, and I was writing under a pseudonym at the time because I was scared out of my mind, and it was dangerous. These people were terrifying. And so I said, look, I really want to write about this incongruity between the photos that they're saying that these are peaceful student protesters, and they've got all these weapons. They've got, it's ridiculous. So he said, well, write an article. So I wrote an article, and I was like, okay, I'm done. And he said, where's the next one? So Stephen and I have been, very close since 2018. And then I came across this stuff with Noam Chomsky, and him, on the wrong position, and Democracy Now! On the wrong position, professors at my alma mater on the wrong position. And then I read Jean Bricmont's stuff, and he was friendly, with Chomsky, but he had the same opinion that Stephen and I did, that this was a wrong opinion, that this was propaganda. So then I started writing to Jean. So I'm very, very happy to have these two gentlemen together on the same show. It's really fantastic because we're all on the same side. And one of the things that I've learned really in knowing both of these gentlemen is that they're humanitarians first, and have love for mankind and humankind. And I think that is the most fundamental thing. If we always maintain this love of humankind, I think we will always, kind of gravitate to the right decisions. We must use, these feelings of love to guide us. And so anyway, it's just I really am grateful that these two gentlemen have joined us, and that they've had a chance to interact.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you. I think mostly you need a correct analysis of the concrete situation, because the love of humankind can go in all kinds of direction, especially, for example,
it could be weaponized. Go ahead, please.
Maybe we'll call the wrap, or you guys may have to go. So
okay.
Yeah,
right,
I certainly have to get going in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this discussion. I learned a lot from both of you. So
thank you.
We have two masters here.
Yeah.
And Stephen is very humble. Stephen is very humble, but
Thank you
he's
very much, Jeremy.
really an amazing editor and a journalist and historian. I mean, he's extremely humble. But I mean, check out
Yeah.
the Consol.
Well, yeah, and I just want to say that I know that you may not have a very big audience, but your programs are really, really important. And so I personally am very, very grateful to you for making the effort, and to Jamie for making the effort to get these programs on air.
Thank you very much. Is the whole discussion in video going to be available on
Yes,
your
it's on.
website?
It's
Yeah,
on.
I'll send it to you.
It's live
I'm
right
going
now.
to post it right now, and then I can email you both in the next 30 minutes.
Okay,
You'll have a
thanks a
copy.
lot.
Yeah, I think it's a great discussion.
Thanks
So.
a lot for your work.
Usually Jamie comes back in to end the show.
Yeah,
So
Jamie?
Jamie, come on, Jamie, come back.
I'm gonna sign off. I think we just all sign off, right?
Well, Jamie usually comes back and he plays
where
the the closing song and wraps up with some words. Jamie,
Otherwise, I think
there
we
he
have-
is.
Okay.
Okay. Hey.
All right. Well, I'm gonna sign off. So
Me
I'm
too.
gonna post it now online. So see you guys.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and thank you, John. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, let's just wrap it up because I've got workers here in my apartment, so I've got to take care of that. So thanks to everybody watching. I hope you enjoyed the show today. This has been Uncontrolled Opposition. It is a presentation of Pasta to Go with our executive producer, Craig Pasta Jardula. So thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another episode, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one, everybody.